What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Best Bets episode for UFC Serbia Uros Medic versus Daniel Rodriguez, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. So, after last week's safety lock win, it brings us on a 2-week win streak, 29-11 overall in every safety lock I've ever provided on this channel. And my goal is to continue cooking up with these safety locks, So, let's start out this week with the most confident picks, where we got Stephanie Luciano, Robert Valentin, and Uros Medic. Starting off with Stephanie Luciano fighting Marina Spasic. I'm leaning towards Stephanie Luciano here since both women prefer to keep the fight standing. I think this matchup comes down to who is the cleaner, more technical striker, and I believe that's Luciano. Marina Spasic, she does have some real power, solid boxing combinations and dangerous leg kicks, but she tends to thrive in chaotic exchanges and she can get drawn into brawls, and I feel like that will play into the favor of Luciano. I think Luciano's discipline will be the difference. She should use her footwork, range management, and 3-inch reach advantage to keep Marina at the end of her strikes. Avoid any prolonged pocket exchanges and then pick her apart from distance over 3 rounds. Luciano also has the more complete skill set and could mix in takedowns if she wants, which is another way for her to score points. Luciano, she has a strong Muay Thai background and she's consistently shown sharp, disciplined striking in the UFC. She defended 9 out of 10 takedown attempts in her debut against Talita Alankar, while outlanding her on the feet. And then she lost a close split decision to a veteran, Sam Hughes, where Hughes relied heavily on the wrestling to make the fight competitive, but Luciano still landed the cleaner shots in that matchup. And most recently, Luciano put on another technical striking performance against Ravina Oliveira, using her jab, leg kicks, and footwork to control the fight. On the other hand, Marina Spasic hasn't been too impressive on the regional scene. So I'm picking Stephanie Luciano to be the cleaner, more technical striker who should control the distance and outpoint Marina on the feet. So moving on to Robert Valentin fighting Dusko Todorovic. I feel like this should be Robert Valentin all day. He's the better athlete here, the more dangerous striker, and the more skilled grappler, in my opinion. I also expect there to be a noticeable difference in power. While Valentin throwing much heavier shots, and Dusko, he's never really been known for his striking, or his power, right? Stylistically, I like Valentin pretty much everywhere here. He'll have a reach advantage, throws with much more power, and I think he's the stronger fighter in the clinch and better offensively and defensively on the ground. Even if both fighters look to wrestle, I trust Valentin to win those exchanges and control where the fight takes place. I just don't see many paths to victory here for Dusko. I don't think he'll match Valentin's power on the feet. I don't see him finding success with his grappling against someone who is a dangerous submission threat himself, like Valentin, right? So I expect Valentin to land the harder shots, control the grappling, and separate himself throughout the fight. Valentin's UFC record doesn't tell the full story, in my opinion. His early losses are against difficult matchups. Ryan Loder and Taurus Finney heavily relied on their wrestling. And while Teba Gutierrez, his most recent loss, he's one of the most dangerous striking prospects in the UFC. Then when Valentin finally got a more favorable matchup against Julian LeBlanc in his last fight, he showed exactly what he's capable of by securing a first-round submission, right? On the other hand, Dusko, he's had plenty of opportunities to establish himself in the UFC, but has struggled against legitimate competition, so I don't see him as this high-level contender. Many of his losses have come by early knockout or just a one-sided striking performances. And his wins haven't done much to convince me he belongs with the better fighters in this division either, right? So Robert Valentin, I feel like he's going to be the more athletic, more powerful, more complete fighter with advantages on both the feet and on the ground. So now moving on to Uros Medic. Final most confident pick versus Daniel Rodriguez. I'm riding with Uros Medic here. I can't see him losing a striking matchup in his home country against someone who is not only older and not as athletic as him, but against someone who's never really been a legitimate contender. He's never really been a legitimate prospect, Daniel Rodriguez. I've picked Uros Medic to win each of his last 3 fights against Gilbert Urbina, Muslim Sadikov, and even Jeff Neal as a sizable underdog. And he's delivered every single time. And after seeing him win those fights with the performances he put on, proving all his doubters wrong over and over again, There's no way I'm jumping off of the train now. I think the biggest difference in this matchup is going to be the speed and explosiveness. Medic is the younger, faster athlete, and I expect him to use that to his advantage. His straight left hand, body kicks, and knees, they're all dangerous weapons, and he does an excellent job fighting at range before exploding into combinations. I can see him picking Rodriguez apart from the outside and eventually finding a knockout shot. His last loss, Uros Medic, his last loss, it was about 4 fights ago to Punahali Soriano. That doesn't worry me as much. It doesn't worry me much because Medic, he made a defensive mistake by dropping his hands after exiting an exchange, and Soriano has the kind of one-shot power to capitalize on that instantly. And I don't think Daniel Rodriguez carries that same level of fight-ending power. So Medic he's allowed to make that mistake, and he won't get severely punished for it, right? Rodriguez, he's entering on a 3-fight win streak in this matchup, right? But I'm not overly impressed by the level of competition that he's beating in his last 3 fights. Those wins came over Alex Morono, Santiago Ponzinibbio, and Kevin Holland. Before that, he was losing to Neil Magny and Kelvin Gastelum. So while Rodriguez is a durable veteran with solid boxing volume, I don't think he matches with Medic's speed, explosiveness, or finishing ability. I do think Rodriguez could become a more dangerous fighter in this fight if the fight extends into the later rounds, where his experience and his pace can start to take over. But early on, I expect Medic to be the one dictating the action, compromising Daniel Rodriguez with his speed, his precision, and his one-shot knockout power. It should allow him to hurt Rodriguez before the veteran can get to settle into the fight, right? So I'm picking Uros Medic to be the faster, more explosive striker who should land the heavier shots and find the finish before Rodriguez can take control, right? So let's move on to the lock of the week this week. Navajo Sterling, lock of the week, versus Jan Blachowicz. I think this is a passing of the torch fight. Jan Blachowicz, he had an incredible run. Became champion, has one of the biggest wins in the sport over Israel Adesanya when Adesanya was just murdering everyone. But at this stage of his career, I think it's Navajo Sterling time to emerge as a true contender. Sterling has all the tools to win this matchup. He's younger, faster, and coming off of back-to-back knockout victories with a ton of momentum behind him, right? His distance management as well, it's one of his biggest strengths. And I think that'll be key here against Blachowicz. If he can stay disciplined, avoid Jan's power, and fight at his preferred range, I see him consistently landing the cleaner and more accurate shots. The biggest threat, of course, is Jan Blachowicz's legendary power, that Polish power. His left hand can change a fight instantly. So Sterling has to respect that. But I think Navajo is the more dynamic striker. He throws with much more variety, uses his footwork well, and mixes in the calf kicks and jabs, and he has the speed advantage to stay one step ahead throughout the fight. Jan Blachowicz's recent fights, they have been competitive. He's not getting ran over by anyone he fights, but that's also part of the concern. He's no longer dominating opponents. He's been scraping by in close fights, and against a young, hungry, undefeated prospect like Sterling, I think that's going to be a dangerous position to be in. I also wouldn't be surprised if Jan tries to rely more on the wrestling to slow the fight down. But even then, I like Sterling's chances. He's physically strong, has solid takedown defense, and I think he'll be able to keep the fight standing long enough to showcase his striking, right? Staying at range and picking Jan apart. I expect Sterling to stay composed, manage the distance, outwork Blachowicz over 3 rounds, and continue building his rise up the light heavyweight rankings. So I'm picking Navajo Sterling to be the younger, faster, and more versatile striker who should avoid Blachowicz's power and outpoint him with a superior movement and volume, right? So moving on to our underdog of the week. Underdog value of the week this week. We got Ludovic Klein by decision. 6 out of Klein's 8 UFC wins have come by decision. And look, this isn't an underdog, I know, but I realized I actually picked only one underdog on this card. And I'm not super confident in him either this week. So I've decided I'm taking Ludovic Klein here, and I like him to win by decision. These aren't actually the correct odds for Klein to win by decision. Those odds aren't out yet, but I'm guessing it'll be around the +300 or 400 area, right? If I'm wrong, I'd be surprised. It'll definitely be plus money for sure. And I think Klein's footwork his distance management and his technical striking will be the difference over 3 rounds. Like I said, 6 out of Klein's 8 UFC wins have come by decision. I expect him to land the cleaner shots, while Tafik Musayev shoots for takedowns to slow the fight down. Tafik Musayev, he is a dangerous fighter with heavy hands who likes to pressure forward, throw big combinations, and mix in the takedowns, but I think that style plays right into Klein's greatest strengths. Klein is the cleaner striker, throws with much better precision, and does an excellent job controlling the range. Even though he's 2 inches shorter, Klein, he'll have a 4-inch reach advantage, which should help him keep Tafik at the end of his punches. And I also wasn't very impressed with Tafik's last performance against Ignacio Bahamondes. Bahamondes dropped him early in the first round, hurt him again in the second round, and then Tafik grabs the fence with both hands to stop a takedown before eventually ending up on top, and then starts headbutting Ignacio Bahamondes. And no points deducted either, right? And Tafik, he finished strong in that third round with a spinning elbow, but it wasn't a performance that convinced me he was the better fighter that night, right? And on the other hand, Klein, he has looked outstanding recently. Against Mateusz Rebecki, he consistently outstruck him with sharp counters, body kicks, jabs, and excellent footwork. And I picked Klein to win that fight, Even after suffering an ankle injury late in that fight, he showed incredible toughness by surviving the final round and still winning the decision. That performance highlighted both his technical striking and his heart to stay in the fight and keep fighting, right? Stylistically, I think Klein, he has the perfect game plan here to frustrate Musayev. Every time Tafik tries to pressure forward, I expect Klein to be circling, landing counters, and then using his movement to avoid getting trapped against the fence. If Musayev shoots for takedowns, I trust Klein's takedown defense enough to keep the fight standing for the majority of this fight. And I don't think Klein's necessarily finds the finish here, because Musayev is durable in the striking, and he's dangerous as well. But I do think Klein will consistently land the cleaner, more accurate shots while avoiding the biggest moments from Tafik, right? Over 3 rounds, that should be enough to earn him a win in the scorecard. So that's why I'm picking Ludovit Klein by decision. He has a superior footwork, cleaner technical striking, and strong takedown defense. It should allow him to outpoint Musayev over 3 rounds. So let's move on to the parlay section. Starting off with the safety lock, the 2 soldiers I am sending out this weekend to be in the safety lock are Navajo Sterling and Uros Medic. I'm favoring the youth and recent form for Navajo Sterling against an older veteran. And for Medic, he is not losing in his home country in a fight that favors him stylistically. You're giving him a slow old man, Daniel Rodriguez, who's willing to stand and strike with him. I see Navajo and Uros being the cleaner, faster, more technical strikers. And at minus 130, these are 2 of the most technical strikers on the card. Navajo Sterling has the speed, footwork, and distance management to avoid Jan Blachowicz's power and outwork him over 3 rounds. Uros Medic has a major speed and explosiveness advantage over Daniel Rodriguez, and I expect him to land the bigger shots early before Rodriguez can settle into the fight. So both, they have stylistic matchups that play directly into their strengths. So let's move on to the ultimate lock at plus 120, Sterling and Valentin. I love the value on this one. Sterling is the younger, faster, and more dynamic striker, while Robert Valentin, he should have the advantage everywhere against Dusko Todorovic, in my opinion. Valentin throws with much more power, has the better grappling, and is even the more complete fighter overall. Both Navajo and Robert, they are in great spots to make statements in their matchups. All right, so moving on to the fun KO parlay, minus 135, Sipo and Oliveira. This is a parlay where I expect both guys to win by knockout, but I'm taking them by their money line, right? Vlasto Sipo, he's an aggressive finisher who always pushes the pace against Gilbert Urbina, who basically just stands still and lets guys hit him at will, right? So it plays directly into Sipo's favor. And then Michael Oliveira is another dangerous striker with serious finishing upside. If both fights here, they stay standing, there's a great chance one big exchange ends them before the judges are needed in this matchup, right? So let's move on to the 4 most confident picks. You got Sterling, Luciano, Valentin, and Medic at plus 305 for the 4 most confident picks. You got Navajo Sterling, the superior movement, speed, and distance control in his matchup. Stephanie Luciano, cleaner, more technical striker with the reach advantage. And then Robert Valentin, better athlete with more power and stronger grappling. And then Uros Medic, explosive sniper with the speed and knockout ability to overwhelm Rodriguez early. This parlay combines 4 fighters. I believe they have clear stylistic edges and multiple paths to victory in their matchups, right? So let's move on to the fun duo parlay. Plus 195 for Milos Janicic and Bogdan Grad. This is a plus money play. Both fighters here, they're aggressive, exciting prospects with momentum on their side, and they have the ability to put statements on statement performances in their matchups, right? It's not the safest parlay in my opinion, but I expect both of these guys to fight with the smarter game plan. Bogdan Grad should be able to pretty much land at will against Denis Bezukia. Milos Janicic, he should be able to keep the fight standing and then land the cleaner shots, right? Moving on to Underdog City Sprinkle. Ludovic Klein by decision at plus 325, maybe plus 425, somewhere around that area. This is one of my favorite props on the card in terms of value. I think Klein's footwork, reach, and technical striking allow him to frustrate Tofik Musayev for 3 rounds. Musayev is dangerous with his pressure and power, but I expect Klein to stay disciplined, defend the takedowns, the majority of the takedowns, and land the cleaner counters. And he's going to win the striking exchanges, in my opinion. So rather than chasing a finish, I see him methodically outpointing Musayev on the scorecards, and it's a strong value of a payout at plus 3 or 420. I'm guessing that's the odds is going to come out. Maybe at plus 200, but I don't think it'll go any higher than that. Than the 400 range, right? So that does conclude the best bets for this week's UFC Serbia Uros Medic versus Daniel Rodriguez. Hope you guys found this helpful. Till next time, peace.